Welcome back out on the mushroom trail. It's another just beautiful October day out here in the Pacific Northwest. And I tell you, there's more mushrooms popping out right now than I could possibly feature in a single episode. So what I'm going to do is highlight a few that are really jumping out at me, some of my favorites. Let's jump into this forest. Let's see what we see. Moving just up the trail, boy am I excited to share this mushroom with you all. This is newly added to my list of all-time favorite mushrooms. And we'll talk about why, but for starters, this is growing in a fairly large group underneath a western red cedar. On the surface, it just looks a lot like a lot of other white mushrooms that you may bump into in the forest out here. So you can see this has a white cap. We see an enrolled margin on these younger specimens here. And in a lot of ways, this looks really similar to a lot of the Clitosibes or maybe even the sweetbread mushroom, Clitopolis prunulus. But as I feel this cap, it's really firm and it's got almost like a velvety feel to it. It's kind of dry on the surface. It's very robust and it has a rubbery texture. We can see something was eating on the side of this one. But as I give it a tug, so you'll notice that it looks pretty similar to a lot of Clitosibes. And as I turn this over, notice that it's got somewhat decurrent gills that run down the stipe there. You can see it's going to be convex at first. In age, this is going to flatten out, and it can get to be really sizable, say 20 to 30 centimeters in diameter. So pretty good sized mushroom. But what's most unique about this one is how persistent it is. You know, David Aurora has really funny write-up about how to differentiate this from Clitosibe. The first one involves smashing it against a brick wall, and if it breaks, he says it is a Clitosibe. If it just bounces off, it's this one, the Leucopax. But the other one is sticking it in a shoebox of, say, a housemate and checking back in a month later. And this one is so persistent that you can check back on this weeks later and it's going to look just as fresh and vibrant as ever. So incredibly persistent. But here's one feature that I didn't read about in any field guides, and this absolutely blew my mind. So a lot of you may have heard reference to the idea that, oftentimes I'm going to carry around a UV flashlight that's a 365 nanometer flashlight, just an excellent little tool or piece to have in your foraging toolkit. If for nothing else, just the spectacle of just really kind of geeking out on some of these natural organisms that'll fluoresce in UV light. Well, I happened to pull this out just in my process of surveying this mushroom and correctly identifying it, and what I saw absolutely blew my mind. Check this out. Look at this. Just beautiful fluorescent blue. You can see that it's only really fluorescing across the gill structure. So you'll notice that the cap and the stipe really don't do anything too spectacular, but when that light gets shining on the gill surface, you see there's clearly a fluorescent chemical compound in there that is causing quite the spectacle. And this is something that, to be totally honest, I'd never observed before. This isn't something that I've heard other folks talk about or I've heard reference to. So, a lot of times I'll just bust out this flashlight just to kind of, survey and test and see what happens. And sometimes I'm absolutely amazed by what I see. And that's certainly the case here, to such an extent that I've got to say, over the course of the last week, I've come back to this exact same spot over and over again, just totally geeking out on how beautiful of a sight this is. So let's get into more of the details and particularities about this mushroom. I hope that this is one that you can all track down because, boy, if you do, it is certainly worth spending some time with. Let's take a closer look. The Latin name for this mushroom is Leucopaxillus albissimus, and albissimus loosely translates to whitest or very white. We commonly refer to this one as the large white Leucopax. And again, large because this can get to be a huge mushroom. In fact, it's one of our largest decomposers that we'll find out here. One of my favorite regional mushroom books that I have, Mushrooms of British Columbia by McMinnon and Luther, actually refers to this mushroom as being a trichiloma imitating a clitocybe. And I think that's an excellent description of what this one looks like. It really is kind of in between mushrooms, and you know, it has a really distinct, difficult to describe aroma or smell. I've asked several people to describe it and they all struggle, and I do too, but it's really a strong, kind of unique odor that once you smell it, you'll know it. And again, if you have a UV flashlight, 365 nanometers, and you hit the underside with this, boy, I don't know of any other mushrooms that look similar to this that will fluoresce this incredible neon blue color. So again, that's the electrons in these compounds reaching excited states, so jumping to higher orbitals, and then as they come back down to a resting or ground state, they're releasing photons of energy in that fluorescent blue spectrum. And aside from having a white stipe, gills, and cap, this is also going to bear a white spore print. And you can see I took one here on foil, and then I also was curious to hit that with a UV light. You can see how that turned out right here. Pretty amazing. You'll also notice that oftentimes the stipe will bulge out a little bit before tapering down at the base. So that's something that doesn't always show up, but oftentimes does. And as referenced earlier, these are oftentimes going to fruit in these, troops. So there'll be large numbers of these, not all the time, but oftentimes. And sometimes they'll actually form fairy rings. Now, again, that persistence and their ability to hold on for weeks and weeks on end without showing any sign of decay is also super unique. And that's caused a lot of people to look into the chemical constituents that are contained within this mushroom in search of potential bioactive compounds that could be used medicinally. One that they found, 2-aminoqualine, is actually a super rare compound in nature that is known to be antibacterial, antiparasitic, anti-tumor, and anti-mutagenic. So this is one that, there was a study dating all the way back to 1988 that identified and isolated this compound, but there's still a lot of research that needs to be done to look more deeply into it. So aside from potentially hosting a whole suite of novel antibiotics, another reason why this one is super fascinating has to do with the fact that it's one of our mat-forming fungi. And so it really has a tendency to influence soil ecology. And in fact, the hyphal threads are so aggressive and abundant that they'll take over a whole part or section of the forest floor. And once they do that, they're going to actually select for a very unique suite of what are known as mycophilic bacteria. So it's really interesting. They've done quite a few studies. I was just reading a paper published on the NIH website from, I believe it was a study in 2023, that looked at the bacteria and specifically the bacterial richness and diversity being significantly reduced within this circle where this particular fungi was present. And if we scratch underneath, notice in between these mushrooms, all of that is mycelium. So this is forming this really unique mycelial mat, and there's tons of research that still needs to be done looking at the mycophilic bacterial guild associated with this. So there are certain fungal bacterial interactions going on that all affect inevitably the soil nutrient cycling, plant productivity, and potentially have implications that could affect or enhance human health as well. So more questions than answers, but this is one that affects our soil ecosystem in very significant ways. I just can't resist. Gotta hit it one more time. Isn't that amazing? One of the true treasures of the forest here, Leucopaxillus albissimus. Keep an eye out under those western red cedars or even your redwoods if you're down in California. This one is really widespread, so the distribution is vast, but it's not especially common. but the simple fact that it sticks around for a really long time increases your chance of encountering this one. So keep an eye peeled. And if you haven't played around with a UV flashlight, I'd encourage you to do so. This can be an awesome identification tool. Makes a great gift too, so I'll leave a link to this in the description. You can check out the one that I use. So right now, I'm actually surrounded by hundreds, if not thousands, of one of my favorite mushrooms that comes out during the fall and winter season. So this is a cold weather mushroom. I've got several patches of this in different areas, and I've checked within the last week or two, and several of them are just booming right now, which feels a little bit early, but by the same token, we've had a significant shift in the weather where it's starting, those overnight lows are starting to get lower than they were. Some of you may recognize this one. This is not your typical culinary mushroom. It's one that people really seek out around the holiday season for baking. So believe it or not, this is a mushroom that's used in desserts, and it actually has a sweet kind of maple syrup-like flavor to it. It actually contains the same chemical compounds as maple syrup, so it's going to have a very sweet taste to it. You can see this is a very mature one. What I want you to notice before I pick this is that the actual cap of this has a texture that's kind of rough, like say like an orange peel or an orange rind. And similarly, if we give this a snap, you'll notice that it snapped really easily. These has a hollow stem or stipe. You can already see a little bit of lactation. If I go ahead and I hit this just with my nail, you'll notice that it's gonna exude a milky latex. Notice too that the kind of consistency of this is of course indicative of it being in the Lactarius genus. It's one of the milk caps. But this is oftentimes described as having the consistency of skim milk. So it looks almost watery as opposed to opaque. You also see these really kind of distinct gills that are slightly decurrent, so they meet the stipe and begin to run down it a little bit. This is the candy cap mushroom, Lactarius rubidus. And this is one that, boy, it is just such a unique culinary mushroom, and it's one that if you haven't tried it, you definitely should add this to your to-do list. It's just a wonderful, wonderful mushroom. So I sort of want to be careful where I step in here, because if you look around, so there's a lot of really obvious mushrooms. This is a massive, massive patch of candy caps, and it has, you know, a unique feature in the sense that they're all highly visible. So these are all really, really apparent and easy to see, which isn't always the case, because a lot of times these like to grow in and amongst ferns and different kind of undercover. But the reason why I'm being really, really careful about where I step is I know that it's still early in the fruiting season for this. So if you look down here, these are also little candy caps that are just beginning to bud or fruit out. So they're not all breaking through the surface just yet. So I really want to be mindful of not trampling this particular area. But boy, there's more here than I could possibly pick. And so it's one of my all-time favorite patches for that reason. It's sort of impossible, it feels, to exhaust this particular patch. And again, you know, there's a lot of other Lactarius genus mushrooms, so different milk caps that are out here that'll oftentimes fake people out. One of the key things that you can do while you're out here in the field is to really kind of pay heed to the surface or texture of that cap. So a lot of times people will compare this to, you know, as I referenced earlier, like an orange rind or an orange peel. The other thing that's a pretty apt description is kind of like newt skin. And so it's got that really unique feature. And then also, if you do harvest this, and notice it's got that brittle stipe that just kind of splits or breaks really easily, so you don't necessarily need a knife to forage these. Again, you've got that watery kind of milky latex that comes out, but also the scent or aroma of this. Let me give it a whiff. So right now it's got a little bit of an aroma. It's somewhat distinct to me, but only because of the fact that I've spent quite a bit of time with this one. But where it's really going to shine, or that aroma is really going to become noticeable and apparent and smell like maple syrup, is given a couple days of drying. So I would recommend, after you forage or harvest these, if you have any doubts or uncertainty about whether or not you've stumbled across the right mushroom, go ahead and, just throw them in a basket or on the counter. Let them dry out a little bit. If they are in fact candy caps, it will be unmistakable. Oftentimes the scent or aroma of these will actually fill the room. So this is really an incredible mushroom. What I'll typically do is I'll dry these out and I'll store them in a mason jar, preferably, like some sort of airtight container so that they retain their freshness. And when I'm ready to use them, I'll actually grind them up just in a coffee grinder and powder them, and then add them to baked goods. I've also sauteed them fresh, just the way they are. They've got, again, that really unique kind of, almost tastes like salted caramel or maple. They're really a pleasant and unique experience. So can't recommend them enough. So if you're out here in the Pacific Northwest, get out there. These guys are really popping out. One of the first videos that I actually posted to YouTube was just a really short 3-minute kind of descriptive video on ID and use for this. So if you haven't checked that out, I'll link it in the corner. You can give it a look. It's all kind of text on the screen, but it's a short, kind of succinct summary of the key kind of identifying features of this. So really an awesome mushroom. Again, that's the candy cap, Lactarius rubidus, showing up out here. Awesome mushroom. So a quick pro tip on this one. If you really are eager to find the candy cap, what I would recommend is find this tree. This is our local beaked hazelnut tree. It's going to have a soft kind of almost furry leaf that you can see has this serrated edge. Really distinct pattern. And if you find it right now, it'll still have its leaves on it. A lot of times at the base of this, you'll notice all these slender kind of trunks or branches. So it's got kind of a somewhat shrubby growth, and it'll grow kind of clumped or fused together. A lot of times with sword fern and in these little berms, this is where I always find my best patches of the candy cap. And I haven't seen that at all in any of the literature, but it's one of those things that, I've tested that over the years, and without fail, all of my best candy cap patches are sourced right in and amongst the hazelnut. So I suspect that there's some type of, mycorrhizal relationship going on there that just might not be well understood or documented. But that's my pro tip for the day for you. If you're seeking out the candy cap, seek out the hazelnut here in the Pacific Northwest. That's going to be your #1 indicator, in my experience, for the perfect habitat for these guys while you're out in the forests of Western Washington or elsewhere in the Pacific Northwest. So keep your eye peeled for that. Let me know if you've had similar experiences or similar successes with that. I'd be really interested to hear from you, because like I said, it doesn't seem to be represented in the literature or in the field guides, but from an anecdotal standpoint, it certainly has been my experience. So let me know your thoughts on that. I'd be curious to hear from you and see if that's something that you've ever noticed or observed, or if you've never paid attention to it, pay attention to it this year. See if that pans out, if that's near all your favorite candy cap patches. I suspect it may be. And boy, it's just absolutely beautiful back in here. There's so many mushrooms that, to be totally honest, it's kind of tricky deciding which to film and discuss and talk about, and which to leave behind. But I wanted to point out this one really quick. This is a really cool little mushroom. This is one of our wax caps. Take a look at this. Isn't that beautiful? I'm going to turn this over so that we can get a look at the gills of this guy. I love these wax caps, and I always look forward to this time of year when these guys really start to come out in abundance. Just look at that. Isn't that beautiful? And these, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this genus in general. A lot of times they're known for just being particularly vibrant and colorful. And then they also have this waxy little feel to them. It's tough to describe until you put fingers on it, but really does have this waxy kind of sheen to it that's quite unique and such a just incredible little mushroom. Super excited to be seeing these starting to show up. So those, of course, examples of Hygrocybe. So very excited to see those, and of course right next to them, I don't know if some of you caught it a second ago when I panned through here, but of course we've got plenty more Pacific Golden Chanterelles popping up, so those are looking good. You know, it's funny, I was just in my local co-op at the grocery store earlier this morning, and I was shocked to see Pacific Golden Chanterelles on sale there. For the regular marked price was $9.99, which is insanely low, and they were 20% off. So you could get them for $7.99 a pound in the grocery store. So, which is really indicative of just kind of how abundant they've been this year. I've been hearing that the commercial pickers are hardly getting paid anything. I think upwards of, say, $2 a pound at this point, which is just a sign of how awesome of a mushroom season this has been. If you're not a commercial picker who's doing this for a living, that's music to your ears, because it basically just means that there's a ton of great wild edible mushrooms, specifically chanterelles, that are just fruiting in such numbers that the supply is surpassing the demand this year. So that means for all of us that are out here looking for mushrooms to bring home to the table, there's more than enough out here for everyone. And just as I peruse this area, I see tons more of Pacific Golden Chanterelle flowers fruiting in and amongst the slough. So I might just get a few to add to tonight's dinner, and I'll probably leave the rest out here. But really, one heck of a mushroom season, so very cool. And just up here on the side of the trail, we've got another fantastic example of a waxy cap. This one commonly referred to as the Western Witch's Hat, Hygrocybe singerii group. So this is actually a species complex. There's likely several species that are all kind of flying under the same common name and even scientific name out here. So you'll notice this has this conical top to it. You can see where it gets its common name. Certainly has that witch's hat shape to it. And again, just like that other waxy cap that we saw, this is of course in the Hygrocybe genus. And you know, these colors, the reds and the oranges and the yellows, are really typical of the waxy caps. We can see some just beginning to come up over there. But what a beautiful little mushroom. Now, one of the things that makes this one relatively easy to identify is, aside from its conical top, notice how, do you see a little blackening up there on the cap of that older, more mature one? That's something that's really typical of this one. So if you actually give this a tug and you start handling it, or you see one that's been, you know, brushed up against or nibbled on or the like, or maybe even just aging, they'll oftentimes blacken. Boy, look at the way that the light he's catching this. So you can see that cap. Again, this has a really waxy, sometimes people describe it as a greasy kind of texture or feel to it. Boy, look at that stipe. So you can see a little bit of graying or blackening. We see that light gill structure underneath. Little hair stuck to the cap of this one. Boy, just look at that. Isn't that a beautiful mushroom? One that I always love to encounter out here. And, you know, as I referenced earlier, yeah, take a look at that. So you can see that darkening. Look at, even as I handle this, you can see this hollow stipe. See how it's starting to turn gray or black? Again, that's really kind of unique. And again, I can't necessarily get this down to a specific species, and there isn't even a lot of consensus over the naming within the Hygrocybe singerii group. But, you know, it really is distinctive, and it's something that you're likely to encounter out here this time of year. So just a real beauty. And I'll tell you, with Halloween just around the corner, I can't think of a more festive mushroom to encounter out here in the forest late October. Beautiful western witch's hat. And wow, take a look at this. Just off the trail, look at how much is going on this single log. We've got multiple species. Here, a Stropharia growing from wood, likely Stropharia hornemanii. Right next to it, we've got some honey mushrooms in the Armillaria genus. These are growing from the same chunk of wood here. And, you know, I'm sure several of you know or are familiar with the honey mushroom. This is a fascinating mushroom. Not only is it edible, with caution, it causes some sickness and GI upset and flu-like symptoms in some people, whereas others can eat it. But it has a long history of use, especially in traditional Chinese medicine. And most notably, it's one of the largest living organisms on the planet. So a cluster of these down in Oregon takes up roughly 2,400 acres and is affectionately known as the humongous fungus. What floors me the most about that particular cluster of Armillaria is that it's noted for being anywhere from 2,000 to 8,000 years old. A lot of times when we see a mushroom, we think of it as kind of this fleeting thing. It's tough sometimes to remember that this organism could be literally thousands of years old. Just fascinating to think about. Now, here in the Pacific Northwest, we've got a lot of different species of Armillaria. And taxonomically, it's one of the most complicated groups because even within a single species, there can be considerable variability within the fruiting body. So it's very difficult to confidently pin these down to species while you're out here in the field. But oftentimes these are harvested, especially at this age. And, you know, people may have a sense of their own ability to digest or consume this one. Now, if we look at this Stropharia that's growing next to the Armillaria, which I gotta admit, I'm kind of surprised to see these sharing habitat here, because the Armillarias are known for just taking over an area, and they'll oftentimes compete actually with the cauliflower mushroom, which we featured last week. The cauliflower typically winning out. But these Stropharia, I believe that they're Stropharia hornemanii for the simple fact that they've got super shaggy stipes, and they're also growing from wood. And you'll notice that some of those had like an umbonate cap as well. So tough to say for sure, but here on the Armillaria, you'll notice that it's got widely spaced gills, it's going to have white spores, it's got a really pronounced ring or collar on the stipe. This is very typical of these honey mushrooms. So really cool to see, and believe it or not, we've even got a third species of mushroom back here. So kind of remarkable to just kind of focus in on exactly how many things are going on. But right under these Stropharia mushrooms and next to the Armillaria, we've actually got a cluster or group of puffballs as well, which is just amazing to see how much is going on. So cool to see. There's so much going on out here. No telling what's going on underneath the surface of this wood. I can only imagine. And just up here on the side of the trail, we've got yet another massive patch of candy caps, Lactarius rubidus. And a lot of times this is the way that they'll present. So notice in and amongst the mosses and the ferns, we catch just a little flash of orange. And you may well find that the first, 20, 30 orange Lactarius kind of, milk caps that you turn over may not be the one that you're after. They may not be the candy cap, but they're out there. So be persistent, keep looking, searching for these. Notice those leaves, look what they belong to. Again, the beaked hazelnut. I'm telling you, this is the key to locating these here in Western Washington and other parts of the Pacific Northwest. This whole little grove of hazelnuts is just full of these. And this is one of those things where, you might see a single little speck of orange just off the trail. Look closely, because once you do locate one of these, they're going to come back year after year. And this is, in terms of a seasonal kind of late fall, winter mushroom, this is kind of the ultimate. So we've done everything from make salted candy cap caramels to butter cookies, candy cap butter cookies. And, I know that sometimes people will even put these into curries, so they'll be doing say a sweet savory curry, and they'll add the candy cap for that extra little bit of flavor. So really an incredible mushroom that is out in full force right now. So keep your eyes peeled out there and in amongst the hazelnuts and along the trails. And I bet sooner or later you're going to stumble across this one. So keep an eye out, and maybe this one will find its way into your basket. And I just had to briefly pull the camera back out because I just wanted to give you all the opportunity to see or get a better sense of the hiding places that this guy will find when it does grow or fruit amongst the ferns, which again is fairly typical. I know that first spot that I showed you, they were all in plain sight, but this is actually, I would say, the bulk of what I encounter out here is oftentimes in these mossy kind of sword fern laden berms under hazelnut. And look at those hiding down there. So this is one of those mushrooms that really, if you spot a single one and you think you're in the right habitat, I'd encourage you all to slow down, kind of peek behind the ferns. A good excuse to just kind of spend some time in one area, just kind of moving amongst these ferns and seeing what you see, because they have a knack for hiding, but they usually, when they're there in abundance. And here's a familiar little mushroom. Take a look at this little clump. This is what's known as the deep purple bolete, Xerocomellus apioperdon. These, boy, there's a few of them here that are just tiny little mushrooms. So this is one of our suede boletes. Boy, I love actually encountering these young, small, little deep purple boletes. They actually are somewhat underrated. They make for good eating, I think. They've got a really unique lemony flavor. And, in the not too distant past, these would have been described as Zeller's boletes, but recent genetic kind of review has identified this as a unique species, the deep purple bolete, Xerocomellus apioperdon. And it's going to have this bright red stipe, kind of a purplish dark cap. And you'll notice when you look closely that it almost has a somewhat bumpy texture. Great little mushroom, out much of the year here in the Pacific Northwest. And here's a beautiful little mushroom. This is the Western Amethyst Deceiver, Leucopaxillus amethysteo-occidentalis. And even though this is regarded as edible in some field guides, there's a really similar species in Europe, a Leucaria, that's known to accumulate arsenic, incredibly high levels of arsenic. So I feel that this one best left admired on the forest floor, but certainly a beauty. And just up here on the side of the trail, look at this. We've got a nice little clump of one of our boletes. These ones in the Swillus genus, so these are known as slippery jacks as a whole. So this is what's commonly referred to as the fat jack, Swillus caryolescens. And in this youngest state like this, these have a nice firm structure, and a lot of times people will actually forage these, and it's all about the preparation when it comes to this. So if you were to take this and dry it out and then later powder it and add it to your soups or stews, it can really add quite a bit of flavor. But the texture can be a bit of an issue for a lot of people. If I set this down, let's take a look underneath. So you can see that the sponge structure is covered up by this veil. So if I brush that aside, you can see that yellowish sponge underneath that's protected by that partial veil in its youngest state. Now there are a couple Swillus species that can look pretty similar at a young age. So, there's another one that you may be familiar with, known as the matjack, Swillus lakei. But this one, I'm very familiar with this forest trail that I'm on right now, and if my experience from years past serves me right, very confident in this being the fat jack, Swillus caryolescens. And boy, this is kind of prime time and prime state to forage and to dry out. So keep your eyes peeled, and if you haven't tried this, I'd be curious to hear from you. If you do give it a try, let me know what you think about it. The jury's out on this one. I think, it's easy. If this is a little far past its prime, it's tough to warm up to the texture. But at this young age, I will say that this fat jack is probably the most preferred Swillus that you'll find out here in the forest. It tends to be the best edible one. And take a look just back and tucked away in the forest back there, I'm catching a glimpse of yet another deep purple bolete, Xerocomellus apioperdon. But that's not really what caught my eye. If we look up here along the side of the trail, on this old red alder log, we've got a really interesting sight. So aside from this old jelly fungus, which looks to be likely Callicera cornea, it's been attacked by a little bit of a mold and is on its way out. But down here is what I'm really most interested in foraging here today. We've got what's commonly referred to as turkey tail, Trametes versicolor. So one of our most widely studied and most highly utilized medicinal mushrooms. This is one of those ones that this time of year I tend to work with quite a bit. This is something that I use to boost my immune system. Notice on the top we're going to have banded colors, and this can, have quite a bit of variability, but it's always going to have these fine felty hairs. The colors can range from these browns to even purples and greens. On the underside though, let me set this down. This is the real kind of clincher on ID for this. So if you look really closely, you'll notice these really fine pores on this white undersurface. This is really distinct, and this is one of the key features that you're looking for when you're looking to positively identify turkey tail. And again, this time of year, this is really coming out in force, and it's one of those ones that I'll typically forage most days that I'm out. I'll just kind of forage a little bit here, a little bit there, but it's one that I always like to have in supply during the cold and flu season. So I'll oftentimes cook this down and add it to soup stock or just make a hot water extract tea, and one that I really enjoy. So take a look at this. This is one of my favorites to encounter this time of year. So this is typically referred to as being carbon antlers or even the candle snuff fungus. And on the white outer kind of edge, it's a powdery asexual spore. that if this were dry, if I were to flick the end of that, you would see it would look like a wisp of smoke, which hence the name candle snuff. Down towards the base, you'll see like warty little pimply formations, and that's where the actual sexual spores are produced. But this one, oftentimes associated with red alder, but this is growing off a big leaf maple, and there's likely several species out here flying under the same misapplied name, but always a pleasure. So check this out. This is a super interesting find out here. This is what goes by the common name purple jelly disc or purple jelly drops. This is Ascocorine sarcoides, and this particular mushroom, I featured this in the first long form video that I posted quite a while back, and I discussed a guy by the name of Gary Strobel, a professor with the Montana State University in Bozeman, who's actually a plant pathologist who he had done quite a bit in South America, so in Patagonia and southern Chile. And he had looked into what he believed was Gliocladium genus endophyte that he harvested from a plant and took back to his lab and kind of observed that what he described as being the essence of diesel fuel. So this prompted quite a bit of research, and that's, ultimately he realized that this is the fungus that he had actually observed. And so this is the famed mycodiesel mushroom that still more questions than answers in regards to its capabilities to produce diesel fuel, but interesting nonetheless. And oh boy, this is super interesting. So believe it or not, I'm on my way back and I'm right across from where we saw that white Leucopax. And this is super interesting because we're a stone's throw away. And what I'm observing here is actually a mushroom that presents in a similar fashion initially, but it's one that I referenced as being, similar but different from that Leucopax. So this is actually what's commonly referred to as the cloudy Clitocybe, Clitocybe nebularis. And notice that it also has decurrent gills, right? But it's got this little bit of a gray streaking or color on the cap. This is going to be a lot more delicate. It's also going to have white spores or a cloudy spore print. And if I pull this one out, let's see if we get lucky. We may observe, so notice the gills look kind of similar. See a little bit of a spore print up there on the cap? That's kind of a cool thing that you can observe if you ever find mushrooms that are overlapping like these ones were. Sometimes you can get a free look at that spore print. So this one is going to be quite a bit more delicate. If we apply David Aurora's test and we throw this against a wall or stash it somewhere in a housemate's shoebox, this is going to surely both destruct more easily, and it's also going to decay more readily. I can see, even as I handle this, look at how easily I can break this. So this has a totally different consistency than the rubbery kind of feel or sturdy feel of that Leucopax. So this is not Leucopaxillus, this is in the Clitocybe genus, and this one, the cloudy Clitocybe. So also a very common mushroom out here on the forest floor this time of year. So good to kind of see these all in the same day to kind of get that instant comparison. And boy, they definitely have very different characters from one another. So this is one to keep an eye out for. This is the cloudy Clitocybe, Clitocybe nebularis. And here's a cool find just up here off the side of the trail. Look at what we see here. So you can see that it's just starting to fruit out on this red alder log. Notice that we've got this kind of felty, velvety cap. So this is actually, I believe that what we're observing is a young fruiting of the turkey tail, Trametes versicolor. So again, we saw one that was further along earlier, and these are just starting to really bud and fruit out on our red alder logs, also on big leaf maple. Those are the two that I tend to observe this on most frequently out here in the Pacific Northwest. So keep an eye peeled for the early beginnings of turkey tail, you can tell that just, a matter of days or weeks from now, this thing is very likely to be in a full flush. So this is one that I'll certainly return to. I'll kind of make a mental note of exactly where this is located. And I'll be eager to return here and to harvest more turkey tail as we get further into the fall or winter season. So this is a good time to kind of be marking these spots on your map and to just kind of pay heed to where the turkey tail is starting to bud out. This is way too early for me to consider harvesting or foraging this at this time in the game, but again, really a great medicinal mushroom, one that I harvest pretty constantly throughout the fall and winter season. And so really cool to see it here in its early stages. Of course, I'll check back on this, so let me know if you have any doubts as to the identity of this, but I would wager a bet that this is going to flush out into a nice fruiting of turkey tail in the days ahead. So very cool to see. And check this out, just down the trail, growing on this red alder snag, we've got a really, really substantial fruiting of what I believe is in the Hypholoma genus. So notice, these guys are relatively young, just starting to do their thing. If we look in there on the stipe, we can see an almost neon yellow with sort of an orangish colored, kind of tawny cap. And all up and down the snag, we see all these tiny little pins fruiting out. So, there's a couple species in the Hypholoma genus that we see fairly routinely, those being the Sulfur Tuft, Hypholoma fasciculare, and the Conifer Tuft, Hypholoma capnoides. The second that I mentioned there is a great edible, whereas the first is a toxic mushroom. So the Sulfur Tuft is the one that is toxic, and that can grow on either deciduous or coniferous wood. This is obviously a red alder, example of deciduous wood, which narrows that down and eliminates our edible species, the Conifer Tuft, Hypholoma capnoides. So again, usually I see these when they're more kind of further along in their growth process. Just beautiful to see them in this young state where they're just starting to kind of come out. In fact, if I look a little further down the trail, I'll show you an example of a more kind of developed species down here. So this is that same mushroom. This is that Hypholoma fasciculare, the Sulfur Tuft, toxic mushroom. We featured this on last week's video, and I pulled out a 365 nanometer UV light to show you the way that this fluoresces in UV. I've actually got one right here. We might as well try it on these younger guys and just see what we get. So let's give that a quick hit. And yeah, look at that. Super distinct. I mean, it's so bright that the camera can barely pick that up. So really cool to see it in this early stage. Boy, look at that little glowing drop on the cap of that one off to the right. That's really, really something beautiful to look at.